Okay, here we are. So let's go over your quiz for first thing. The good news is we actually really did much better on this quiz than we had done on the first two quizzes and even the exam. So that was good, right? There were a lot of, I would consider pretty strong scores on this. And so let's go over the quiz. First off, define the concept of diminishing marginal returns to capital. I think a lot of you knew this was coming, which is good, right? Diminishing marginal returns to capital means as the quantity of capital increases, the additional units of output that you get from that additional capital goes down, okay? So diminishing marginal returns is not, I think a few of you said, well, when capital goes up, output goes down. No. When capital goes up, output goes up, but it goes up at a smaller and smaller increment, right? That's the key to diminishing marginal returns. So in part B, according to diminishing marginal returns, where should new capital be most productive? In poor countries, right? Because they are lower, they have lower amounts of capital and as a result should grow faster. Question number 2, how does the growth experience differ between countries that open themselves to trade and those that are closed? Countries that are open to trade grow faster, right? Why is that? Because of technology transfer, because of capital transfer, because of comparative advantage and specialization, right? Those were just 3 of the things I wanted you to talk at least very briefly about 2 of them. Okay, how about this how about on question number 3? Okay, question number 3 is the question about using the rule of 70. So it says over the last 140 years, the growth rate of per capita GDP has been roughly 2%. Today, we have about 50% GDP, $50,000 per capita GDP. How much richer would we be if we'd grown at 2.5%? So there's a number of ways that you could do this. I think I saw many of you do this different ways. To me, the easiest way to think about this is, what happens if you had grown at 0.5% faster, which is what this question's asking, 0.5%. Well, according to the rule of 70, in 140 years, you would have doubled one more time. So instead of being 50,000 richer today, what would we have been? We would be twice as rich today if we had just grown at 0.5%. And so what's the point of this exercise? The power of compounding, right? You don't have to grow very fast. Small increments of growth, but sustained over long periods of time, can be big differences in income levels. So instead of being $50,000 rich, we'd be twice as rich if we had grown 0.5% more a year. When did the rise in inequality within the US and other countries begin? Well, I guess there's really 2 answers to this. The Industrial Revolution, right, was kind of the original increase in inequality, but in recent times, it began in the 1970s, 1980s, right? And so either of those answers, I was kind of thinking 70s and 80s, but those of you who put Industrial Revolution, you're actually right too. So either answer would be fine. What's meant between the race between technology and education? What's the race between technology and education? I think there's a little confusion about this. The race between technology and education has to do with skills-based technological change. The fact that technology is increasing the returns to getting an education, okay? That technology is very dependent upon having an education. So new technology is raising wages for people that have an education. What's not keeping up? The supply of people who have an education, right? So the demand for education, the demand for educated workers is outpacing the supply of educated workers. That's driving up wages for educated workers. That's leading to inequality, okay? And then question number 6, what's meant by intergenerational economic mobility? What's the relationship between a kid's income and their parents' income? And what are we seeing? There's actually very little economic mobility, right, in the United States. Despite this this kind of story we tell us that the US is a place where everybody can get ahead, we actually don't see that in the data. And so what that means is that poor people are largely trapped to being poor, and rich are kind of safety netted to being rich for the rest of their life, right? And that's not great for economic productivity, certainly. Okay, so that was question number 3, or I'm sorry, quiz number 3. So as I said, I think in general we did pretty well with that. So anybody have any questions about this, that, and the other? So first off, congratulations. You have officially made it halfway through this class, right? That's a nice accomplishment. So you should pat yourself on the back, take a little bit of time this weekend and enjoy your accomplishment. Don't take too much time to enjoy your accomplishment because there is work to do this weekend, right? So just kind of looking ahead a little bit as to what's going on next week. And so you can, if you have a little bit of time this weekend, you can prepare. Next week, our 4th quiz will be on Tuesday. And then our 2nd exam is going to be on Thursday. Okay, the 2nd exam is going to be on Thursday. So the 2nd exam, there's going to be a lot on it, right? Because it's not only going to be about economic growth and inequality, which is on this quiz, but it's also going to be very heavily about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and what we talk about Monday and Tuesday, which is fiscal policy and monetary policy, right? So there's going to be a lot on this exam next Thursday. So this weekend would be a great time to get caught up on your readings. This would also be a really good time to get ahead of your readings, right? And get ready for Thursday because, yeah, right, that quiz is coming up. So just to make sure you all have that on your radar. There's one other assignment in this class that I don't think you have to do much on right now, but let me just say a word or two about it. If you remember when we went over your syllabus, there's a writing assignment in this class, a short current events writing assignment. And so we'll talk more about this next week. I don't really think, I think there's some things that we need to talk about here over the next half a week or so that will help you write this paper. And so in that sense, I don't think that you should go out and start writing your paper. But it is useful to think about it, right? And so really what I want you to do in this paper is to find a current event article related to macroeconomics, right? And I want to emphasize macroeconomics. Something to do with GDP, inflation, growth, business cycles, unemployment, right? These kind of questions. I want you to find a short current events article and do a little bit of analysis on it using class material, right? So it's a relatively short writing assignment. So while I think it's probably too early for you to start writing, right? Because I think there's some things we want to talk about before you start this. It's not too early to begin looking around, right? So if there's been a topic that's really interested you in this class, or you think that you would like to learn more on, or if you're just interested in public policy and there's a specific policy that you've been reading about that you're kind of curious about, that might be something else you begin to look at this weekend. It's just to find a couple of articles, right? Kind of find some articles that look interesting to you. And as we get into next week, then, I'm happy to talk with each of you about articles you're finding and which ones might look good, which ones may not be such a good match. But, in many ways, the hardest part, not the hardest part, but the most important part of this writing assignment is finding the right article, right? I think if you find the right article, one that's the appropriate level and it's interesting to you, then to some extent, I think that actually doing the writing will kind of write itself, right? So, but anyway, you might want to think about that a little bit this week. Other than that, get outside, right? It's supposed to be 47 tomorrow, 47. So when I was walking across campus yesterday at about 2:33, I saw a whole bunch of people in shorts and t-shirts and flip-flops. And it was like about 32. So I completely expect, most of you guys to be out there in your bathing suits, walking barefooted, right? So enjoy it, right? Enjoy the beautiful weather. Anybody gonna go swimming in the ink pond on Saturday? Okay. But yeah, go out and enjoy the beautiful weather. It does feel it does feel a little bit like winter's breaking, and I'm sure that helps all of us kind of psychologically. And spring break is coming, right? So that's all great. So anyway, hopefully you find a little bit of time to be pressurized this weekend, and so that we can come back on Monday and kind of make our big final push for the last week and a half of class. Okay, so what are we going to talk about this morning? Actually, before I say that, I'm going to give you the good news. We're not going to have class this afternoon. Okay, you know how I hate Friday afternoon class. I hate it with a passion. So, not going to have class this afternoon. We will have class this morning, right? We're having class this morning. So we're just going to go, I might go a little bit over 11 o'clock. Let's just kind of see how things work. But I won't go too much over, but I don't want us to meet back here this afternoon, so you have a little bit of time to, like I said, get away from it all. So anyway, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to finish up chapter 12 and talk about business cycles. Recessions, depressions, why are they caused, and what do we do about them, right? That's really the main topic of the day. So let's kind of go back and I guess begin by just reviewing a little bit about where we left off yesterday afternoon. So if you remember yesterday afternoon, we talked about two types of business cycles, two types of recessions. And the first one we're going to talk about this morning is the aggregate demand-driven recession. Yeah, Evan. A business cycle. Yeah, so a business cycle really refers to recessions and expansions. The fact that output tends to go up and down, right? That's what is meant by a business cycle. So yeah, sometimes you hear me say business cycles, but I'm really talking about why do we have volatility in GDP, right? So we talked yesterday afternoon about an aggregate demand-driven recession. And let's talk about this again, make sure that we understand it. As we said, this was the kind of Keynesian recession. And it begins with a fall in aggregate demand, hence calling it an aggregate demand-driven recession. Keynes thought that aggregate demand was very volatile, in part because consumer confidence is volatile, right? It's fragile. And so when bad news happens, when people get scared, what do? They stop spending, they stop investing, and aggregate demand begins to go down. And so if we think about our aggregate demand model, remember, we begin here at the natural rate, right? That's where we always are in the long run. And now people get scared. As we're going to talk about, this kind of aggregate demand-driven recession, I think, is a very good explanation of what has happened here over the last year with COVID, right? COVID, the pandemic, people get scared. Are we going to lose our job? They get scared because they don't want to get sick. So maybe I shouldn't go out to the movies. I shouldn't spend. What happens to spending? It goes down. Aggregate demand falls. As a result, what happens to output? Output falls below the natural rate. We have a recession. Also note that the actual price level has fallen, but the expected price level and the expected inflation rate has not. So at this point, actual inflation is less than expected inflation because prices have dropped, yet people have not anticipated this occurring. What's happened to unemployment? it's gone up too, right? And if you think about what we talked about yesterday, think about what's happened as we moved along this short-run aggregate supply curve. The decrease in prices have led to an increase in real wages. We've had an increase in layoffs, and we've had an increase in unemployment. So this is, kind of the beginning, right, of an aggregate demand-driven recession. And as I said, I think actually largely what's happened here over the last year with COVID kind of fits this picture, right? Because I think the main economic impact of COVID has actually been fear, confidence, right? People are afraid to spend, right? In part they're afraid to spend because they're worried about their jobs, but also they're afraid to spend because they don't want to go out and get COVID, right? So this kind of loss of confidence has really contracted aggregate demand. Firms have gotten worried about what the future brings. They've stopped investing. Aggregate demand has gone down. Output has fallen, right? We've fallen below the natural rate of output, right? We've fallen below the natural rate of output. Now, how does the recession end? We talked about the first option, and the first option is the classical approach. Which is essentially to let the invisible hand work, let prices adjust. Eventually, people are going to reduce their expected inflation rate. Eventually, they're going to reduce their expected inflation rate and they will accept lower nominal wages. Lower wages will increase short-run aggregate supply, will increase production. And over time, we will move back towards the natural rate. So if I can go back to this, hold on 1 second, Evan. Oops, let's not make it in red. Let's make it in blue, right? So if I can go back to this graph, what's going to happen over time? Over time, expected inflation is going to go down and short-run aggregate supply goes up. This will shift our short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and move us back to the natural rate. Okay? So prices, expectations and prices adjust. Short-run aggregate supply comes back and we move back to the natural rate. That will happen eventually. Yeah. Deflation? Well, deflation is technically negative inflation. So it's, it's hard to say whether it's inflation's negative or just very low. It's gotten lower, right? So disinflation might be a better word than deflation, because deflation usually means negative inflation, right? So the economy has gradually moved back, right? People have adjusted to what happens, wages have adjusted, and the economy moves back to the natural rate. What's the problem with this? Well, no, I mean, in this graph, prices have gone down, right? We don't know how long this is going to take, right? Could it take 6 months? Could it take a year? Could it take 2 years? In the meantime, this is a lot of lost output, right? People have lost their jobs, they've lost income. The longer that this kind of lingers on, the more there is a cost to this. And so, this is where I said, the famous quote by Keynes, why don't you just wait for things to work out in the long run? And Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. So Keynes was writing during the Great Depression, right? And we're going to talk about the Great Depression here in a minute, but we think about the Great Depression as starting in 1929, right? But really, the Great Depression, technically it began in 1929. It did not kick in until 1931. So we've gone through 1929, 1930 of a recession. 1931 was when it became the Great Depression. 1932, 1933, we're talking 4 or 5 years, right? That is a long time, right? And so to hear this classical laissez-faire response of, well, the economy is just going to solve itself. Yeah, I mean, Keynes and people who were persuaded by Keynes said, yeah, we can't do that, right? We can't just sit around and let markets work. They're not nearly as efficient as classical economists think, right? They're not nearly as flexible as classical economists think. And so that really leads to the second option. Keynesian stabilization policy. Which is basically to use the tools of government to stimulate aggregate demand. Okay, so if during a recession, this happens, here's our aggregate demand driven recession. Aggregate demand has fallen, prices have fallen, we're in a recession. What should the government response be? Increase aggregate demand. The government should be out there using the tools of policy to increase aggregate demand so that we essentially shift aggregate demand right back to where it was and go back to the natural rate. We increase aggregate demand by increasing output till it gets back to the natural rate. What are the tools that government has to do this? What? A stimulus, right? A stimulus, to some extent, though, is kind of general. It could mean a lot of things, right? Can we be a little bit more specific? Right, so you could You could give a transfer payment, right? The government could just send you a check, which is what these stimulus checks have largely been. What else could the government do? I mean,
Decrease taxes.
cut taxes, which in some sense is very similar to a transfer payment, right? They're really, in many ways, these are the flip sides of the same action. You're just giving people more money. What else could the government do?
Decrease real wages.
Well, not really. Government doesn't control wages, right? Markets do.
Increase the spending.
Increase government purchases, right? Go out there and build more roads, bridges, schools. And then the last one is monetary policy. The Fed, the central bank, could try to cut interest rates to stimulate spending. We haven't talked about this one very much. We're going to talk about this next week, exactly how this works. Okay? So, yeah, these are really the four tools. These are the four tools that, that Keynes talked about. Anybody have any idea which one Keynes thought would be the most effective?
Monetary policy.
Government purchases, right? This was the one that Keynes particularly emphasized. And let's think about why that is. Why is that? Once again, you have to understand the nature of psychology that happens during a recession. Why do we have a recession? People are scared. People are fearful. So what happens if I just send people a check for $1,000? They're going to save it. Keynes was very worried that people would just save these kind of things. And in fact, what have we seen with the stimulus checks that came out last year? They largely got saved, right? They did not lead to any dramatic increase in spending. Likewise, taxes. What happens if you give people a tax cut? They'll just save it. They'll just put it in their pocket. And remember, the whole key is to stimulate spending. The whole key is to stimulate spending. Likewise, Keynes was worried that monetary policy wouldn't work. Why? Because Keynes thought if interest rates get low, but people are still scared, they won't spend money, right? So interest rates can go as low as you want. If people are scared, they still won't spend. So how do you make sure that they're spending in the economy? You have the government spend money. You have government build roads, bridges, schools, right? You make sure the government stimulates aggregate demand directly. And so this is really the idea that Keynes put into the public consciousness. That yes, the government has a role to stimulate output during recessions, and particularly to do it through government purchases, right? And so, you know, we're going to talk about the Great Depression here in a minute, but those of you who are familiar with the history of the Great Depression, you can see the link here between Keynesian economics and the New Deal, right? Because the New Deal, well, it incorporated aspects of all these things. We usually think about the New Deal as this big increase in government purchases, right? Where the government went out and built courthouses and schools and roads and all these kind of things in an effort to try to stimulate aggregate demand. Yeah.
Why does the government spend money make people less afraid of spending money themselves?
Well, it's not that it's going to make, well, let me back up here. If you give money to people, right, in a tax cut, they will put it all in their pocket. If the government spends it, they will spend every cent of it, right? So that's the first part, right? Is that the government's going to spend every cent. But Keynes's thinking is, if you get the government spending money, that will create jobs. And then you have kind of like a positive feedback. That if people are getting jobs, they'll feel more confident about the future. And as they feel more confident about the future, they'll spend more. And we'll kind of get into a positive feedback loop as opposed to the negative feedback of everybody being scared, not spend money, which just makes people more scared. Right? That's kind of Keynes's idea. So yeah, you see the links here between what Keynes was proposing and the New Deal, right? In many ways, the ideas that Keynes brought to the fore were the kind of the theoretical underpinnings of the New Deal. So that's the Keynesian response. Now, are there problems to this? Yeah, and we're going to talk about this more, particularly when we get to next week. There's nothing, there's nothing perfect in economics. And, over time, we've seen that there are some potential problems with this. Isn't this easy? It's one thing for me to draw a graph up here on the screen, but do policymakers really get to see aggregate demand, aggregate supply graphs to know how much they have to change aggregate demand? No, there's a lot more confusion about this in the real world, right? And so, we'll talk about that. Sometimes there can be big lags in policy. There can be lags in policy, meaning the government just can't click its fingers and start spending money. First off, it has to go through the political process, but then you just don't go out and you build a road tomorrow, right? I mean, you got to do some planning. You got to get the permits. You got to find people to build it. I mean, this takes time too, right? This takes time too. So that's another, I think, important question. And then something else that we're going to need to talk about, we'll talk about this on Monday, is the role of debt. Because how's the government paying for this? They're borrowing money, right? The government pays for this by borrowing money. And so we need to think about, well, what's the danger of debt, right? What's the danger of debt in all of this? So in a nutshell, that is the distinction between classical economists and Keynesian economists. Keynesians say, we just can't wait around for the economy to save itself. We need to be more proactive, right? Classical economists tend to believe the market will work itself out. And so, we don't have to do much. And as I said, really, this whole distinction between classical and Keynesians came about during the Great Depression. So let's talk about the Great Depression here a little bit. This is kind of the classic aggregate demand-driven recession. I think economists are, pretty much in agreement that the Great Depression was caused by a series of falls in aggregate demand. All right, a series of falls in aggregate demand. Okay, now, in high school, what did you learn caused the Great Depression? Stock market crash, right? Once again, that's kind of like most of the history you learn in high school, bullshit, right? Not really. I mean, the thing is, we've had stock market crashes bigger than what happened in October of 1929, and we haven't had anything like the Great Depression. So I'm not to say that didn't play any role, but I think economists really view that more as a symptom of the problem, as opposed to the real cause. So what happened? Well, there was undoubtedly there was a huge collapse in confidence. And this is what I mean by the Great Depression was probably a symptom, right, that people got so scared that not only did they stop spending, they stopped investing in the stock market. The stock market was more of a symptom of what was going on. It wasn't really the root cause of what was going on, right? And so there was panic. There was outright panic, right? Outright panic. And it gets back to this idea that we talked about that, you know, the future is not like flipping a coin, right? Because we don't know anything about it. At least with a coin, we know there's a 50% chance heads, 50% chance tails. When it comes to economic future, we really are fundamentally ignorant. And so people are very vulnerable to panic, right? And so, you know, in 1929, there obviously kind of this sense of panic that failed. There was also a number of other factors. There was a big collapse in the farming market. You guys are probably all familiar with the Dust Bowl, right? So there was a big collapse in farming that played a big role in what happened here. There were stock market crash did play some role in this. Undoubtedly, when the stock market crashed, it did reduce a lot of wealth. Now, it's different than today because back in 29, actually very few people held money in the stock market. Right? Today, there's much wider participation in the stock market. But, you know, I mean, the crash did destroy some wealth, and undoubtedly that played a big role. However, these things are all important. I want to focus on two things, though, that were particularly important that most people don't think about. The first was the bank failures, right? Bank failures were really what made the Great Depression the Great Depression. 1/3 of all banks failed in the United States. And this was in the era before we had deposit insurance. So if you had your money in a bank and the bank failed, what happened to your money? It's gone. So this led not only to a big decline in wealth, but almost a complete collapse in finance. And people found it impossible to get a loan. And obviously, that reduced aggregate demand, right? Obviously, that played a huge role in aggregate demand. And then we're going to talk more about this next week. But another important part of the Great Depression was that the US was on the gold standard. So as I said, next week when we talk about money and money supply and monetary policy, we'll be able to talk about this a little bit more. But the gold standard is a particularly bad way of managing your money. Right? It is a particularly hideous monetary system. And so the gold standard really tied the hands of monetary policy. And in fact, today we think that what should a central bank do during bad times? We think that central banks should cut interest rates. And we've seen that with the Fed. The Fed's cut interest rates. But what did the Fed have to do under the gold standard? They had to raise interest rates to stay in the gold standard. We'll explain why this is. So this is exactly the opposite of what we know is the proper policy, right? But you had to essentially shoot yourself in the head to stay on the gold standard. And that's largely what the Fed did during the early part of the Great Depression, right? It's kept on stabbing the economy in an effort to kind of stay on this gold standard, right? So these things all together led to a very, very big decline in aggregate demand. And as I said, it wasn't just one fall in aggregate demand. It was a series of aggregate demand falls, right? A series of aggregate demand falls that kind of reduced output in 30, in 31, in 32, and 33, right? And particularly this period of time between 31 and 33 was really the worst of it, right? The worst of it, where we got these big shocks, in part because that's where the banking crisis was at its peak, between in 1931 and 1932. So, at the beginning of the Great Depression, the president was Herbert Hoover, our Iowan, right? Anybody ever been to Herbert Hoover's house in West Branch? It's only about 20 miles from here. You can go see it. Poor Herbert Hoover, he was actually a really interesting person. And in theory, could have been one of the US's better presidents. Unfortunately, he was completely hampered by the fact that he had no way to think about the economy outside of the classical model. And so when the Great Depression hit, what was Herbert Hoover's response? Don't do anything. Don't do anything. In fact, Herbert Hoover's response was, we better raise taxes so that we don't run a deficit, right? Which, once again, we kind of know that to be backwards thinking today. But, you know, in part, it was just a reflection of not really thinking very clearly about what causes recessions. And so when Roosevelt took office, right, he immediately, or not immediately, but immediately attempted to try to install his New Deal. And if you think about what the New Deal was, it was all about stimulating aggregate demand. We tend to think about the New Deal as big increases in public purchases, right? Like the Tennessee Valley Association, right? And here in Iowa, if you walk around, if you go to any county courthouses, one of the things you'll see is that almost all the county courthouses around here were built in the early 30s, right? They were really part of the New Deal. So big increases in government purchases. But there's some other things that maybe have kind of been lost to history a little bit that happened in the New Deal that are really important. One is we got off the gold standard. Right? That was actually one of the more important things that the New Deal did, is help get the US off the gold standard. The New Deal also involved a big reform of the Federal Reserve System. We'll talk more about this next week, why this was so important. But the Fed that we know today really is a consequence of the Great Depression, right? The Fed that existed before the Great Depression looks a lot different than the Fed that existed after the Great Depression. And then there were a series of bank reforms, including things like deposit insurance. So that if you put your money in a bank and the bank went bankrupt, you wouldn't lose all your money. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week as well. So the New Deal in many ways followed the Keynesian prescription, right? It followed the Keynesian prescription. Did the New Deal work? Well, yes and no, right? Yes and no. Listen, there's no doubt that the New Deal made things better, right? But the fact of the matter is, the New Deal was probably still too small given the size of the problem. Okay, so okay, so here's a graph. Hopefully you can see it online here. of the unemployment rate during the 30s and 40s, and then the budget deficit, basically looking at the difference between spending and taxes. And notice that yes, during 1930 to 1933, when unemployment was at its highest, what happened to the budget deficit? It went up, in part because we were spending more, but it didn't go up that much. The New Deal was relatively small given the overall size of the economy. And so you can see here as the New Deal kicks in 31 and 32, yes, the unemployment begins to tick down, but if you look all the way down here to 1939, unemployment was still above 10%, right? So now we're going on a decade, and unemployment is still greater than 10%. What really got us out of the Great Depression? World War II. Because that's when, you want to think about Keynesian policy on steroids, that's when it got kicked in, right? Where we saw this huge increase in the deficit, and that dramatically brought down the unemployment rate, right? So in many ways, we didn't go full Keynesian until World War II, right? When we began to see very big increases in government spending and very big deficit spending. And so, I don't think there's any doubt that the New Deal worked, or at least it helped. But the size, it wasn't probably big enough for the size of the problem, right? That the size of the problem was huge. And so, I think probably what you learned in your history class was that the New Deal did all this great stuff. And that's not to say that there weren't very many good things in the New Deal, but I think we also have to be realistic, right? That the New Deal was relatively small given the size of the problem. And so while it helped, you can see why this is the Great Depression, right? After a decade, we were still above 10% unemployment, right? Even after a decade. So it's really kind of amazing, and definitely the worst recession that we've had in US history. Let's compare and contrast this to probably the second worst recession that we've had in US history, and that's the 2008 global financial crisis. Let's talk about this a little bit. So I'm going to pretend that you guys all remember a little bit about the global financial crisis, though, of course, when I actually do the math, I don't want to think about how young you were during all of this. But do you have some memories of this happening? See some people saying no, some people saying yes. Yeah, well, this is a big deal, right? This is a big deal. The global financial crisis. The global financial crisis, in many ways, looks like the Great Depression. Once again, we can really kind of see this as a series of falls in aggregate demand. The housing market crash, the mortgage-backed security crash that we talked about a little bit last week, the collapse in consumer confidence, and at the same time, Europe was having its own series of financial crises with the European debt crisis that reduced exports. Okay, let me back up here. Let's talk about the housing market crash a little bit. So I don't know how much all you know about the details of this. But if you remember last Friday when we were talking in chapter 10 about financial systems, we talked about mortgage-backed securities, right? So do we remember that, right? This is that idea that you would sell bonds, right? And take the proceeds to buy mortgages with the idea that all of these mortgages would be very diverse and it would be very safe. And so you could take the proceeds from the mortgages and pay the bonds and still make a lot of money, right? And that was that process we called securitization, of turning an illiquid asset, which is an individual mortgage, into a liquid asset, an asset easy to sell, which is a bond. So this was an amazing innovation, right? Amazing innovation. And these mortgage-backed security bonds were so popular that basically banks, would issue these as much as they could, right? So if you wanted to issue more bonds, what did you first have to do? Issue more mortgages. So the demand for these bonds fuels the supply of mortgage lending in the US. And so all of a sudden, anybody could get a mortgage. And by anybody, I mean literally anybody, because there was so little regulation on some of these mortgages that many people were qualifying for mortgages that quite honestly had no business getting a mortgage, right? Many of these mortgages were what were called ninja loans. Ninja meaning no income, no job, right? You could not have a job, not have an income, and still qualify for a mortgage. Now, you might say, why in the world would somebody lend money to somebody who can't pay it back? Well, here was the thinking of the banks. The banks were looking at what was happening to housing prices. And what were they seeing? Housing prices are going up 5, 10, 15% a year. So what happens if somebody defaults on the house? That's okay. I'll still get the house, right? The house is collateral on the mortgage. So even if somebody defaults, I'll still get the house. I'll be okay, right? That was kind of the in hindsight, idiotic thinking. This idea that somehow housing prices could not collapse across the entire country. Have you ever, anybody ever heard what are the 3 most important things in real estate? This old adage, Thomas. Right, location, 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 right? And what's that really trying to say? It's really trying to say that there is no such thing as a national housing market. Every house is something unique. And so you could really, if you've got houses across the country, you would be diversified and there would be no risk to that. What are the chances that the housing market in Florida would collapse the same time that it would collapse in Arizona? Many people honestly thought it was 0%, that there's no chance that housing market could collapse across the country. And so banks just lend money to people who may or may not pay back their loans. So what happened in 2008? In 2008, interest rates started to go up. A lot of people stopped not paying back their loans. As soon as they stopped paying back their loans, a lot of these bonds started to move into default. As many people began to figure out what was going on, they began to get worried about the housing market. Right? They began to get worried about the housing market. As housing prices began to fall, it led to this vicious circle. So think about the person who, for instance, bought a $200,000 house in which they had a mortgage on their $200,000 house of $190,000. Okay, so they borrowed almost all the money. What happens if the price of that house falls from $200,000 to $150,000? Now they have a mortgage that's worth $190,000 and a house that's worth $150,000. What should you do? Give it back to the bank. It's like making 40,000 bucks, right? Even if you could pay the mortgage, you shouldn't. Because the house is only worth $150,000, you own $190,000 on it, right? It's like picking up $40,000 by just giving it back to the house, back to the bank. And so even people who could pay their mortgages started to default, right? And this just led to a vicious circle, right? Where the bond market collapsed, The housing market collapsed. In the US, about 60% of family wealth is in their house. So when housing markets collapsed, a lot of families saw their wealth disappear and they got scared. A lot of banks began to fail. And what happened when they failed? They stopped lending money out, aggregate demand collapsed, consumer confidence collapsed, blah, 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 blah. You know, in hindsight, this all looks so obvious. But, you know, that's often how it looks in economics, right? Yeah, and in hindsight, yeah, it was so obvious. I will have to say for me, if I can just brag a little bit, I knew that there was a big problem way back in 2006. And I can distinctly remember when I thought that there was a big problem. And it was at Thanksgiving dinner with my idiot uncle, right? So you guys probably all have them, the idiot uncle, right? Who is so unbelievably dumb, right? And annoying and aggravating. And so I can remember my idiot uncle sitting down with him at Thanksgiving dinner, and he spent the whole time telling me about all the money he was making buying houses in Florida and flipping them every 6 months. And he tried to get me in on this deal. And I said, if my idiot uncle is making $50,000 a year doing this, something is not right, right? And unfortunately, you know, in hindsight, yeah, you know, I think many people saw that this was really a crazy system, right? With too little regulation and too much money flopping around. And so it all came to a crash very quickly. So where did we end up? We ended up with a huge fall in aggregate demand. When banks started collapsing and the financial system started teetering, people were panicked, absolutely panicked. They stopped spending. Firms stopped spending, and we had a dramatic fall in output. However, was it as bad as the Great Depression? No, it was not. Right? So the purple line is looking what happened to output during the Great Depression. And the orange line is looking at what happened to output during the global financial crisis. And so we can see the Great Depression was the Great Depression, right? In fact, they started out on the very much the same path. If you look at the first 9 months, they looked very much the same, collapsing. But the Great Depression continued, where we got this bounce back during the global financial crisis. And so the question is why? And the answer is pretty clear. We knew a lot more about how to respond to recessions in 2008 than we did in 1929. In other words, the reason why the economy bounced back is because we followed Keynesian policy. The government really did the things that we talk about in intro macro largely, right? There was a series of tax cuts, first under Bush and then under Obama. The Obama stimulus. That increased government spending. The Fed lowered interest rates and other things, et cetera, that we'll talk about next week. and then the very controversial Treasury Asset Relief Program. The very controversial Treasury Asset Relief Program, which was essentially a bank bailout. All these banks that lost money because of their crazy behaviors, the federal government came in and bailed them out so that they didn't collapse and so the economy could recover. Was this a good idea? Yes. In fact, you can make an argument that this was one of the more successful government programs of the last 100 years. Treasury Asset Relief Program was a program in which the government lent about $700 billion to banks. How much of that money did we get back? All of it and more, right? We actually got a return on this money. Banks paid it back, right? And it did stop the crisis. It stopped the crisis. It stopped the loss of confidence, right? Treasury Asset Relief Program was a huge success. However, if you ask most Americans about it, what do they think? They hate it. They hate it, right? And so despite all of these things working, there has been a conservative critique or a backlash against some of this stuff. And let's kind of talk about why that is. Why do conservatives hate the Treasury Asset Relief Program? Any ideas? Right, yeah, government overreach. Yeah, can we be more specific? Like, because I don't think many conservatives believe the government didn't have the legal right to do it.
More meaning that they should.
Yeah, why shouldn't they do it? Yeah, right. It's like rewarding bad behavior, right? This is an idea in economics called moral hazard. If you incentivize bad behavior, you're going to get more of it. So many conservatives hated the Treasury Asset Relief Program because simply, these were the people who played a big role in creating the crisis. And then what did the government do? Bailed them out so that they didn't lose their shirts. And so the worry is, what's going to happen next time? They'll do the same thing. Because what is the lesson they learned? They can get away with it because their actions put the entire economy at risk. And, you know, I mean, listen, there's definitely an element of truth to this, right? There's definitely an element of truth to this. I think, though, the counter argument is, should we have punished the banks by driving the economy into a ditch, right? I mean, you know, in order to punish the banks, we would have had to punish average Americans. And so, you know, while I do worry about moral hazard, to me, this doesn't, you know, the idea that we should not have done anything doesn't really make a lot of sense. But there is a point. Many conservatives also worry about the increase in debt. That once again, what caused the crisis? Too much borrowing. So how do we solve the problem? We borrow some more. And so, you know, this kind of idea of like the hair of the dog, right? That may not be the best solution to get through the problem. And so many conservatives really worry that the US is setting itself up for a debt crisis because of all this debt that it's accumulated, continues to accumulate over time. This is going to be what we come back to on Monday, right? We're going to talk about deficits and fiscal policy. But that is definitely one of the conservative critiques, right? Is that this just means to more borrowing. And so the crisis was caused by borrowing. And so how do we solve it? We borrow some. And so, these are, many conservatives also argued that this is going to push up inflation. Whenever you try to stimulate aggregate demand, it's going to push up inflation, and inflation is bad. And so while most economists, I think, view what happened during the 2008 global financial crisis as a big success, that doesn't mean that everybody thinks it's a success, right? And, when I say conservative critique here, I really don't think there's many economists in this, right? But politically, this has been very, I think very contentious, right? It's been very contentious. And, I think looking back, we can see that there were a lot of political mistakes made, right? I think people in Obama and people in the Obama administration have admitted that they were so focused on saving the economy that they didn't think about how the politics of all this looked, right? And so a lot of these things were kind of rushed through in the interest of making sure that the economy got better. But on the flip side, because they weren't transparent, they took place very quickly, it raised questions among a number of people. So, all right. So we don't show very many, I don't even know if this is going to work, quite honestly. But I wanted to show you a video. I completely, though, forgot to test this out because I was so distracted by our screen not working before class that I forgot to test out this video. But I'm going to try to show you a video. It may not work, and we won't show it. But let me see if I can get this working, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, I think we can hear it here. So let's see if our friends on Zoom. Can you see this on Zoom?
Yes.
Okay, I hope you can see this. So, okay, what is this? This is kind of stupid, but play along. An economist, I can't remember what school he is, but he wrote a rap about John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek, all right, who are two of the big names in economics. Keynes, we've talked about a lot. Hayek is kind of the classical economist, right? The classical economist who doesn't believe that the government should be involved and believes in laissez-faire and fears debt. And so he wrote this little rap to try to, have fun with the idea and explain kind of the Keynesian perspective on this stuff versus the classical perspective. So I'll show you the video. You can tell me what you think of it. It's kind of cute.
Lord Keynes, welcome, sir. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine.
Your agenda.
That won't be necessary. I am the agenda. Tell them I've arrived, and then tell them I've arrived.
And your name, please?
Hayek. F-A-I.
Freddie. Hey, listen, party at the Fed.
All right, party man.
Lobby. John Maynard Keynes.
F-A-I.
Yeah, we're opposed.
We oppose each other philosophically.
In the same studio.
We've gone back and forth for a century. I want to see your hearts. I want the century. There's a woman, a cycle, and a reason to fear. It's an animal spirit. John Maynard Keynes wrote the book on modern macro. The man you need when the economy's on track. Depression, recession. Now your question's in session. Have a seat and I'll show you one simple lesson. 1929, the big crash. We didn't bounce back. Economy's in the trash. Persistent unemployment. The result of skinny wages. Waiting for the recovery. That's straight out of your head. Like I said, in the long run, we're all dead. Saving construction, that's a paradox of great. Don't you want to even know that both never live with laws of business is driven by the animal spirits, the bull and the bear, and there's reasons to fear it's effects on capital investment, income, and growth. That's why this nation is like every sleeping is spoken for monetary enemies. The people of the works, the indigenous war has the same effect. Comes the glass man, that's the law of multipliers, but the higher the economy's held. And if the central bank's interest rate policy takes a look good, trap back the money, stopping the banks, deficits could be the door you've been looking for. Let the spending soar, now that you know the score. A general theory's made quite the impression. Transform the economy better. You know we modesty still taking it back. So say it loud and say it proud. We're all Keynesians now. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to see your eyes. There's a woman outside with a reason to fear. If I can scream, she listen up and get your own all strokes just like my friend.
All right, there you go. Now you had a little rap in this class, just what you always wanted. So, oops, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you could hear that. Hopefully you could hear that online. If not, you can just Google, what is it, Fear the Boom and the Bust, right? I think that's what it's called, Fear the Boom and the Bust, and you can watch it by yourself. Or all of you. You probably want to watch it 4 or 5 times, right? Get the MP3, listen to it when you work out, I'm sure. But yeah, you know, I mean, this is the argument that continues to go on in economics between liberal, conservative, classical, and Keynesian economists, right? And so, you know, once again, one of the things I think about economics is we're not necessarily about solving these debates, but we're about understanding these debates, right? Understanding both sides of these debates, and then you can make your own mind. And so, you know, at some point, reading the general theory is actually a little dense, I'll be quite honest with you. Though there's other writings by Keynes that I think are quite accessible and well worth reading. If you're ever interested in reading, when you have free time, some Keynes, definitely do it. Hayek, who was in that video, wrote, I think, maybe the most widely read book on conservative political thought. It's called The Road to Serfdom. And so that's a book that I would recommend everybody read, whether you are conservative or liberal. If you're liberal, you might want to understand the conservative mindset. Because I think Hayek in The Road to Serfdom really puts forth the most clear argument for limited government that you can make. And so, yeah, you know, these are the ideas that continue to not just play out in the economics perspective, or the economics arena, but they, of course, clearly shape how we think about our politics and many, many other things. Okay, so we've talked about, to this point, aggregate demand-driven business cycles. Let's talk about another type of business cycle, though. Aggregate supply-driven business cycles. Aggregate supply driven business cycles. So in 1970, we had a series of supply shocks in the oil industry, where essentially there were, at 3 different occasions, the price of oil doubled. And just to be clear here, the economy of the 1970s was much different than the economies of today. We had a much more oil-intensive economy. So today we make about 5 times as much GDP for a unit of energy as we did in 1970. So we use much less energy today to produce more GDP. And so we had a very, very oil-intensive economy. I have to say, sometimes I think back to the 1970s in these very, very happy ways. We had this just big ass car. We didn't wear our seat belts. Our car was so big that, like, in the back window where it sloped back and behind the seat, there's a flat area, and I would stick my little sister up there and she would fit, right? It was great to be driving around in these big cars with no seat belts. Of course, what was the problem? Those cars were getting like 6 miles to a gallon, right? It was crazy. And so what happened in the 1970s? We had a series of very big oil price shocks. So basically in 1971, right? I'm sorry, yeah, 1970, I don't think this is right, actually. 1971 was the Arab-Israeli revolution, and then there was the OPEC oil embargo, where OPEC embargoed the US and prices doubled, and then in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. So in each of these 3 cases, the price of oil doubled. And so that was a huge increase in input costs, a huge increase in input costs. And it happened, as I said, really 3 different times, creating a lot of havoc in the US economy. So how did that impact aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Well, this didn't shift aggregate demand nearly as much as it was a fall in aggregate supply. So short run aggregate supply shifted up and output fell below the natural rate. Notice here, though, that there's something interesting that went on. Not only did output fall, but inflation rose. We really got the worst of both possible worlds here because output went down, but inflation went up. And this is referred to in the popular media as stagflation. Stagnant output growth and inflation. We've never really seen this at the same time before in the US. Both of these things happen. If you think about an aggregate demand-driven recession, what tends to happen to inflation during a recession? Inflation tends to go down during a recession. Here we saw inflation go up during a recession. Right? And so this was a very, very costly series of recessions. Now let's ask the same question that we asked about the aggregate demand recessions. How did it end? Well, one option is you could wait for prices to fall back. What's the problem with that? How long, right? How long? Second option is you could develop new technology that uses less oil. We have done that. What's the problem with this? How long again, right? I mean, this is a process that's taken 40 or 50 years and still not completed, right? This is a very, very slow process. Neither of these two options are really great options in terms of dealing with the crisis. Third option, but I'm going to talk, as I'm going to explain here in a minute, this is not a great option either. This is the option that the government largely picked. Unfortunately, this has a whole range of implications that the government didn't accept or didn't anticipate. So let's think about what happened here. So I'm just going to redraw the graph that I drew before. Okay. So here we have our aggregate demand, or I'm sorry, our aggregate supply driven recession. And we've moved over here, right? Where output is falling. So what did the Fed and the federal government try to do? They immediately got involved in trying to stimulate the economy, right? The policy response, particularly among the Fed, was to try to increase aggregate demand. And that's what they did. to try to increase output back towards the natural rate. But do you see the problem with this? What's the problem? Prices, right? Prices started going up because of the oil, and then they started going up because of all the increase in aggregate demand that the Fed and the government was putting into the economy. And so what happened during the 70s? During the 70s, this essentially happened 3 times. So I won't draw it up here, but you can think about doing this 3 times, right? Prices just kept on going up and up and up and up at every iteration. And where are we then by the 1980s? By the 1980s, we had gotten close to about 20% unemployment. I'm sorry, 20% inflation, right? So you can see here, inflation is low in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, it starts to go up and up and up, right? And by 1980, we are, up here 16 to 18% unemployment, or I'm sorry, 16 to 18% inflation, depending upon how you measure it. So the Fed completely let inflation get away from it. And so you can see here the big increase in the price level, the big increase in inflation. And inflation is very costly, right? For reasons we've talked about. It reduced a lot of wealth. It weakened the financial system. Now people couldn't get loans. Banks were failing, right? It was a very, very stressful time. And so today, it's hard for us to think about this, but in 1980, what was the number one issue in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan? What are you going to do about inflation? That was the number one issue that election was run on. And Reagan ran on a platform basically of cutting inflation, right? He ran on he called it the misery index, which is inflation plus unemployment. And so he ran on a program of cutting them, right? Cutting inflation in particular. And so, well, that's great. How do you cut inflation? Well, if the government increasing aggregate demand raised inflation, then what do they have to do to cut inflation? They've got to cut aggregate demand. This was particularly by the Fed. Oops, sorry. Switch back. Okay, so the Fed's solution to cut inflation was a big cut in aggregate demand, a big reduction in aggregate demand. So what did essentially the Fed have to do? We were up here by 1980 in a situation where we had high inflation. Even if we were at the natural rate of output, we had high inflation. So what did the Fed have to do? They had to reduce the price level and try to drive down inflation. But of course, what was the cost? A massive recession. So in other words, the government essentially purposely drove the US economy into a recession, right? It was on purpose. Now, it had an objective, and that objective was to squeeze inflation out of the economy. Did it do that? Yeah, it did, but it was costly. This recession that took place in 1981 was the sharpest recession since the Great Depression. Okay, so it was a very, very sharp and costly recession. So if you go back and you look at the data, you can see how quickly the Fed got inflation back under control, right? I mean, it really chopped inflation dramatically, but very costly, right? Very costly, very, very costly. And so here's another graph. This is looking at what happened to the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And this is kind of a crazy graph, but just play along with me here a minute. Here we are in January of 1980, okay? Right at the top left corner. Follow the line as we go. And you can see what was happening throughout most of the or at least the early parts of the 1980s, is inflation was going down, but unemployment was getting driven up by this big recession, right? In an effort to drive down inflation, the policymakers essentially drove up unemployment. But then the good news is what happened as markets adjusted. As markets adjusted, unemployment went back down to the natural rate, right? And that whole process that we talked about before. So in other words, if I can go back to our graph, what happened over time? Over time, expected inflation fell and short-run aggregate supply went up, and we moved back toward the natural rate. But it took time. It took time. So just in that same process that we've talked about before, the economy will adjust, but it takes time. It takes time. So policymakers, particularly at the Federal Reserve, and we'll kind of talk about this story a little bit more next week. Policymakers at the Fed acknowledged that what happened in the late 70s and early 80s was really one of the probably the biggest mistake in, well, at least in recent Fed history, right? It was a big mistake. It was a big mistake. This really raised a lot of questions about Keynesian economics, right? Because here you're following the Keynesian textbook, you're following the cookbook, and yet you screwed things up, right? And so it really, I think many economists began to lose faith, or at least began to question a little bit more a lot of the precepts of Keynesian economics, particularly this idea that whenever things are bad, you increase aggregate demand, right? Maybe that's not the solution to every single problem in the economy. So we'll talk more about this next week, right? As we talk more about the limits of Keynesian stabilization policy, the good things, bad things. I do, though, want to suggest to you, though, that while Keynesian policymakers have made mistakes, overall, we have more stable economies than we used to. And almost certainly, a lot of this is because we have better government policy, because of the ways that we understand the economy working now in ways that we didn't before Keynes. So, if you go back to the 1890s, you see, and actually, if you go back before this, recessions and depressions were a regular fact of life. And some of them were quite big, including the Great Depression. But what's happened since the Great Depression? That we've had more stable economics, right? The data suggests that recessions are about 20% smaller and about 30% shorter than they were before the Great Depression. And why is that? Well, there's probably a number of reasons, but undoubtedly some of it is because we have better policy. We've learned, right? We have, as economists and policymakers, have learned not to make the same mistakes. But having said that, that does not mean that there's not critics of all this. And as I said, next week we're going to talk about some of the criticisms of this Keynesian stabilization policy, including, what about debt? What about inflation? What about moral hazard? This idea that you're incentivizing bad behavior. Is there a possibility that you could make policy mistakes like what the Fed made in the 1970s? Can politics play a role in screwing this all up, right? Do we trust politicians to manage this? Okay, so these are all critiques of Keynesian policy that we'll come back and talk about next week. I will say, though, that at least for those first two, while there are many criticisms, there's also reasons that we shouldn't be so worried. Here's just looking at interest rates, right? If the US had so much debt, and if markets were really worried about the US being able to pay back its debt, what would happen to the interest rate on US debt? It would be going up, right? In fact, what have we seen? Interest rates are at historic lows for US debt. Markets can't buy enough of this debt. So despite worries that the US has too much debt, markets don't seem to think so. People are happy to buy government bonds, right? They're buying billions and trillions of them all the time. So, this is where we're going to come back on Monday, right? When we talk about the debt and whether we should be worried about it. Likewise, inflation. Many critics, many conservative critics of Keynesian policy have said, oh, this is just going to lead to inflation. We're going to have another repay of the 70s. Have we? No, we haven't, right? We basically have the same, we've been on the same path that we were, right? We have not seen a big increase in inflation. In fact, inflation today is lower on average than it's been since almost any time since in the 1800s. So, overall, I think many of the things that we've learned from Keynes have been very valuable. That's not to say that there aren't critics, and it doesn't mean that there's not the possibility of mistakes, because there definitely are. But okay, so I actually think that gets us through chapter 12, right? Got a couple minutes here. So that's it, right? You guys got to have a good weekend. Monday, we're going to come back and talk about chapter 13 on fiscal policy and debt. Okay, so that's what we'll pick up on Monday. Remember to think about your exam on next Thursday. And if you have any questions, you can always send me an email. Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.